At breakfast, my granddaughter said, "When she dies, we'll finally have peace in this house." I drank my coffee in silence. That same day, I removed their names from the deed. They only found out when the notice arrived. I still remember how the sunlight streamed through the kitchen window that morning, casting long shadows across the breakfast table. Elizabeth, my 17-year-old granddaughter, didn't even lower her voice when she said those words to her mother. They both thought I couldn't hear them from my place at the table, or perhaps they simply didn't care if I did. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted my coffee cup to my lips, but I made sure not to spill a drop. 73 years on this earth had taught me one thing. Sometimes silence is the most powerful response. So I sipped my coffee, pretended to focus on my crossword puzzle, and let their conversation continue as if I weren't there at all. "Mom," "Shh," Susan, my daughter, whispered to Elizabeth, though her reprimand lacked any real conviction. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching. "But seriously," she added in a quieter tone that still carried across our small kitchen, "we need to discuss what to do with all her stuff when the time comes. There's so much junk in the attic. Junk. That's what they called the memories of my life. Photo albums of my late husband Robert and me building this house with our own hands, handcrafted quilts I'd made for each of my children, the collection of antique teacups my mother had passed down to me. Junk to be discarded as soon as I was gone." I set my coffee cup down gently, folded my newspaper, and excused myself from the table. Neither of them looked up as I shuffled out of the kitchen. In my bedroom, the smallest room in the house now. Since Susan had claimed the master bedroom 3 years ago, I closed the door and allowed myself a moment of clarity. This wasn't a sudden revelation. The signs had been there for years, ever since I'd invited Susan and Elizabeth to move in after Susan's divorce. What had started as me helping them had somehow twisted into them taking over, pushing me further into the corners of my own home. My opinions were dismissed, my preferences ignored, my very presence treated as an inconvenience. I looked around at the cramped space I now occupied. The rest of the house, the home Robert and I had built together, where we'd raised our children, where I'd tended gardens and hosted holiday gatherings, had been gradually claimed by Susan and Elizabeth. My belongings relegated to this room and some boxes in the attic labeled "Mom's stuff" or simply "old things." I didn't cry. Instead, I reached for the phone and made 2 calls. The first to my attorney, Gerald, who had handled Robert's estate after his passing. The second to my bank. By noon, I had appointments with both for that afternoon. "I'm going out," I announced, grabbing my purse and car keys. Susan looked up from her laptop, surprise crossing her face. "Where are you going, Mom?" she asked, her tone suggesting I needed permission. "Just some errands," I replied, my voice steady. "Don't wait lunch for me." The meetings took less than 2 hours. Gerald was surprised at my request, but didn't question my decision. The bank manager was equally efficient. By 4 o'clock, I had initiated the process to remove Susan's name from the deed to the house, a name I'd added 5 years ago when she convinced me it would protect the property if anything happened to me. I also revised my will, removing both Susan and Elizabeth as beneficiaries. As I drove home, I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a deep, hollow ache. When had my daughter become this person? When had my granddaughter learned to speak of my death so callously? And when had I become so invisible in my own home that they could discuss discarding my life's memories as if I weren't sitting right there at the table with them? I pulled into the driveway of the blue 2-story colonial that Robert and I had lovingly built 45 years ago. The flower beds I once tended were now overgrown. Susan had never taken to gardening. The porch swing where Robert and I used to sit in the evenings was gone, replaced by Elizabeth's exercise equipment that she rarely used. That evening passed like any other. Susan cooked dinner. Nothing like the meals I used to prepare, but I'd been gently pushed out of kitchen duties years ago. Elizabeth stayed glued to her phone, occasionally showing her mother something that made them both laugh. I ate quietly, offered to wash the dishes as I always did, and was declined as I always was. "We've got it, Mom. You'll just take forever," Susan said, not unkindly, but dismissively all the same. I retreated to my room early, as had become my habit. Through the thin walls, I could hear them talking and laughing in the living room, the TV blaring one of those reality shows they both enjoyed. I sat in my rocking chair by the window, looking out at the starry night, and waited. 2 weeks later, the certified letters arrived. I was in the garden, attempting to salvage what was left of my once beautiful rose bushes, when I heard Susan's cry from inside the house. "Mom, what is this? What have you done?" I straightened up slowly, my knees protesting after an hour of weeding. I removed my gardening gloves, tucked them into my pocket, and walked inside to face the storm I knew was coming. Susan stood in the kitchen, the official letter from Gerald's office clutched in her hand, her face pale with shock and anger. Elizabeth hovered behind her, confusion written across her young face. "What's going on?" I asked calmly, as if I didn't already know. "This says you've removed my name from the deed to the house." Susan thrust the paper toward me. "And there's another letter saying you've changed your will. What is this about, Mom?" I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and wondered when we had become strangers. When had the little girl who used to run to me with skinned knees and broken toys transformed into this woman who saw me as nothing but an obligation, an inconvenience to be tolerated until I died? "I think you know exactly what this is about, Susan," I said quietly, my voice steady, despite the ache in my heart. "I was sitting right there when you and Elizabeth discussed what a relief my death would be." "Mom, you're overreacting," Susan said, her voice dropping to that condescending tone she'd perfected over the years, the one that made me feel like I was the child and she the parent. "It was just a casual conversation. Elizabeth didn't mean anything by it." I looked at my granddaughter, who suddenly found the pattern on her socks fascinating. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "I was sitting right there," I repeated, feeling a strange calmness settle over me. "Right at the table with both of you." "Grandma, you always take things so personally," Elizabeth finally spoke, rolling her eyes with the dramatic flair only teenagers can master. "It wasn't about you." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Not about me, my own death, the disposal of my belongings, the peace they'd finally have when I was gone. How was that not about me? "I think we all need to calm down," Susan interjected, setting the letter on the counter as if distancing herself from its contents might make them disappear. "Mom, we'll talk about this when you're thinking more clearly." And there it was, the subtle implication that I was confused, that my mind wasn't what it used to be. It was Susan's favorite tactic whenever I disagreed with her about anything, from what to make for dinner to which doctor I should see. I didn't argue. Instead, I turned and walked back outside to my roses, let them think what they wanted. The wheels were already in motion. As I knelt in the garden, pulling weeds from around my struggling peace roses, I couldn't help but think about how we had arrived at this point. It hadn't happened overnight. Like the weeds slowly choking my beloved flowers, the disrespect and dismissal had crept in gradually over the years. Robert had been gone for 7 years now. My strong, quiet husband who had built this house with me, who had always made sure my voice was heard. After his heart attack, I'd rattled around our family home alone for nearly 2 years before Susan's marriage to David collapsed. "It's just temporary, Mom," she'd said, standing on my doorstep with Elizabeth and 4 hastily packed suitcases. "Just until I get back on my feet." I'd welcomed them with open arms. My daughter, returning home after 15 years. My teenage granddaughter, who I barely knew but desperately wanted to connect with. I saw it as a second chance. To be needed, to be useful, to have family filling these 2 quiet rooms again. The first changes were small, almost imperceptible. Susan suggested rearranging the living room furniture to create better flow. Elizabeth needed the second bedroom as her own space to process the divorce. Before I knew it, Susan had her eye on the master bedroom. "Mom, that big bedroom is wasted on just you," she'd said one evening. "You're hardly ever in there except to sleep. Elizabeth's growing. She needs more space than that tiny second bedroom. If you took the guest room, we could move Elizabeth into the second bedroom, and I could take the master. It makes more sense for the flow of the house." There was that word again. Flow. As if my presence in my own bedroom somehow impeded the current of their lives. I gave in. I told myself it was a mother's duty to sacrifice for her children. I told myself Susan was still healing from her divorce, that Elizabeth was a teenager who needed stability. I packed up my belongings. Robert's things had long since been boxed away in the attic, and moved into the smallest bedroom in our house. The guest room became my room. The second bedroom became Elizabeth's room, the master bedroom, where Robert and I had spent 40 years of married life, where we'd whispered dreams to each other in the dark, where I'd held his hand as he took his last breath, became Susan's room. It wasn't just the bedrooms. Gradually, my cookbooks disappeared from the kitchen shelves, replaced by Susan's collection of diet and superfood guides. My handmade curtains were taken down, stored somewhere in the attic, replaced by modern blinds that let in half the light. The family photographs I'd carefully arranged on the mantelpiece were rearranged, then reduced, then replaced entirely with Elizabeth's school pictures and Susan's professional headshots. I became a guest in my own home. "Mom, I'm having some friends over for book club. Would you mind staying in your room tonight? We need the living room. Grandma, can you not watch that old people's show so loud? I'm trying to make a TikTok. Mom, we're thinking of painting the kitchen. I know you've always liked this yellow, but it's so dated. We're thinking a nice gray would brighten things up." Yellow was Robert's favorite color. He'd painted the kitchen himself, whistling as he worked, stopping occasionally to dab a spot of paint on my nose and steal a kiss. I gave in every time, said yes to every request, retreated further and further into silence and acquiescence. I told myself I was being flexible, that I was lucky to have family around me in my old age, that many people my age were completely alone. But somewhere along the way, flexibility became invisibility. My opinions weren't just overruled. They weren't even sought. Decisions about my home, my belongings, my life were made without my input. The breaking point hadn't been one big incident. It was 100 small cuts, being talked over at dinner, finding my garden tools moved and never returned, having the television channel changed without asking while I was watching something, discovering my reading glasses had been tidied away into a drawer I never used. And then, finally, hearing my own granddaughter casually discussing the peace my death would bring, as if I were nothing more than an inconvenient houseguest who had overstayed my welcome. I looked down at my hands, dirt under my fingernails from tending. The roses. These same hands had rocked Susan as a colicky baby, had bandaged her scraped knees, had applauded at her college graduation. These hands had helped build this house, brick by brick, alongside Robert. These hands had created a home, a life, a legacy. And now, these hands had signed papers ensuring that home would remain mine for whatever time I had left. I heard the back door open and close. Susan's footsteps approached, hesitant on the garden path. "Mom," she said, her voice softer now, contrite even. "We need to talk about this. You can't just change everything without discussing it with me first." I looked up at my daughter, this stranger who had my eyes and Robert's stubborn chin, and felt a strange mixture of love and detachment. "That's exactly what you've been doing to me for 5 years, Susan," I said quietly, "making changes without discussing them with me first. The only difference is, this is actually my house, not yours." Susan's face flushed at my words. "That's completely different," she snapped, crossing her arms. "I've been making improvements to this outdated house. I've been modernizing things. Without asking me," I pointed out calmly, turning back to my roses. "Without considering that, some of these outdated things have meaning to me." "Mom, be reasonable. You can't possibly expect everything to stay frozen in time like some sort of museum to Dad." Susan's voice softened artificially, taking on that placating tone again. No change is hard at your age." "At my age," I echoed, a small smile playing at my lips despite the sting of her words. "I'm old, Susan, not incapable. There's a difference." Susan sighed dramatically. "I don't have time for this right now. I have a Zoom meeting in 10 minutes. We'll discuss this later when you're being more rational." She turned and walked back to the house, her posture rigid with indignation. I watched her go, wondering when exactly my daughter had become this person, someone who could dismiss me so easily, who could speak of my death as an inconvenience delayed rather than a loss, to be mourned. The days that followed were tense. Susan oscillated between cold silence and attempts at manipulation, bringing me tea in the morning with forced cheerfulness, reminiscing about her childhood as if to remind me of my maternal obligations. Elizabeth mostly avoided me, earbuds firmly in place whenever we happened to be in the same room. I maintained my quiet resolve. The deed had been changed back to my name only. My will had been updated. There was nothing they could do about either. A week after the letters arrived, I was in the attic searching for an old photo album. Susan had relegated most of my personal mementos to various unlabeled boxes up here, and I'd finally worked up the energy to sort through them. The late afternoon light filtered dimly through the small window, casting long shadows across the dusty floorboards. I hadn't expected to find anything beyond my own boxed-up memories. But as I shifted a stack of containers marked winter clothes, I noticed a folder that had fallen behind them. Curious, I picked it up and opened it. Inside were printouts of real estate listings. Houses in a neighborhood across town, much newer and more expensive than our modest colonial. Attached to one listing was a handwritten note in Susan's distinctive script, perfect when Mom's gone. Can use house sale plus inheritance for down payment. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped through more papers. There was a printed email. Exchange between Susan and a real estate agent dated just 3 months ago. As I mentioned, my mother is getting quite elderly, and we anticipate having the house on the market within a year or two at most. We'd like to get pre-approved for the new property so we can move quickly when the time comes. The agent's response was equally matter-of-fact. Completely understand your situation. Many families in your position want to have plans in place. I've included information about bridge loans that can help you secure the new property even before your mother's house sells. I sat back on my heels, the folder clutched in my hands, a strange numbness spreading through me. They weren't just casually discussing what might happen after my death. They had been actively planning for it, counting on it, building their future, on the assumption that I would soon be gone and everything I owned would be theirs to claim. As if that weren't enough, I found another folder beneath the first. This one contained an inventory of sorts, a list of items in the house with notes beside each. Dining room set, good condition, should sell well. Antique secretary desk, Elizabeth wants for her apartment. Silver tea service, could get $1,000 from that dealer on Main St. Those old quilts, donate the quilts. My mother's quilts, hand-stitched during long Minnesota winters, passed down to me with love and care, and Susan wanted to donate them, as if they were nothing more than worn-out blankets cluttering up space. I continued reading, a hollow feeling expanding in my chest with each notation. Mom's jewelry, mostly outdated, but the pearl necklace and diamond earrings Dad gave her are worth keeping. Photo albums. Keep a few for show. Digitize any good ones of us. Discard the rest. Dad's old records. No one listens to vinyl anymore. Sell the collection Robert's Records. His beloved jazz collection that he'd curated so carefully over decades. The Ella Fitzgerald album he played the night he proposed. The Duke Ellington record we danced to in our living room on our 40th anniversary, just months before his heart attack. Discard the rest. That's what my life, our life, had been reduced to. Things to keep, things to sell, things to discard, as if the memories attached to them meant nothing. As if I meant nothing. I was still sitting there, surrounded by boxes and clutching those damning folders when I heard footsteps on the attic stairs. Mom? Are you still up here? Dinner's almost ready. Susan's head appeared through the attic access, her expression shifting from mild annoyance to alarm when she saw what I was holding. What are you doing with those? I looked up at her, suddenly seeing my daughter with perfect clarity. Making plans for when I'm gone? I asked quietly, holding up the real estate listings. Deciding what parts of my life are worth keeping and what should be discarded. Susan's face flushed. You were snooping through my private things? In my attic. In my house. I stood slowly, my knees protesting after sitting on the hard floor for so long. The house you've been planning to sell out from under me. That's not fair, Susan protested, climbing fully into the attic now. We weren't planning to do anything while you're still... She stopped abruptly. While I'm still alive, I finished for her. How considerate. You're twisting everything, Susan said, her voice rising. Of course we have to think about the future. That's just being practical. And you put me on the deed, remember? You wanted me to have the house. I put you on the deed so you'd have a home if something happened to me suddenly, I corrected her. Not so you could start measuring the drapes while I'm still breathing. God, you're being so dramatic, Susan huffed. This is exactly why we didn't discuss these things with you. You take everything so personally. I almost laughed at the absurdity. How exactly should I take plans to sell my home and dispose of my belongings, Susan? Impersonally? Susan reached for the folders. Give those to me. You have no right. No right? I pulled back, clutching the evidence of their betrayal. I have every right. This is my home. These are my things. This is my life you've been so casually planning to erase? Something shifted in Susan's expression then. A flicker of guilt, quickly replaced by defensive anger. You know what? Fine. Keep the folders. It doesn't change anything. You're being selfish and unreasonable as usual. As usual, I repeated softly. When exactly did I become selfish and unreasonable, Susan? Was it when I invited you and Elizabeth to live here after your divorce? When I gave up my bedroom? When I stopped cooking in my own kitchen because you said my food was too old-fashioned? When exactly? Susan had no answer. She turned and stomped down the attic stairs, calling over her shoulder, "Dinner's getting cold. Come down or don't. I don't care anymore." But she did care. I realized as I carefully tucked the folders into my sweater pocket. She cared very much. About this house, about what she could get from it, about the future she was planning that required my absence. What she didn't care about was me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed in what used to be the guest room, staring at the ceiling, the weight of my discoveries pressing down on me like a physical thing. All these years, I'd told myself that Susan and Elizabeth needed me, that we were a family, supporting each other through difficult times. Now I understood the truth. They didn't need me. They needed what I could give them, a house, an inheritance, a future built on the end of mine. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, it liberated me. Morning light filtered through my curtains as I awoke, with a strange sense of purpose. For the first time in years, I felt completely clear about what I needed to do. The folders I discovered were safely hidden under my mattress. Evidence of betrayal, yes, but also my freedom. Knowledge, as Robert always said, is power. I dressed carefully, choosing a blue sweater Robert had always liked and the pearl earrings he'd given me on our 30th anniversary. Looking in the mirror, I saw not the faded, diminished woman Susan treated me as, but Martha Wilson, widow, mother, homeowner, and a woman who had finally had enough. Susan was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, aggressively tapping at her laptop. She barely glanced up as I entered. "Coffee's made," she said curtly. "Thank you." I poured myself a cup, adding cream and sugar as I pleased. Susan had been pushing me to drink it black for my health, but today I didn't care what Susan thought about my coffee or anything else. "I'm going out today," I announced, sitting down across from her. "I may be gone most of the day." Susan looked up, surprise briefly replacing the lingering anger from our confrontation yesterday. "Where are you?" "Going." "I have some errands to run," I said, using the same vague explanation I'd given when I'd gone to change the deed. "Don't worry about lunch for me." "Fine," Susan shrugged, already looking back at her screen. "Elizabeth and I are meeting with her college counselor anyway." I nodded, though she wasn't looking at me, and finished my coffee in silence. Neither of us mentioned the folders or our argument. The silence between us felt different now. No longer the suffocating quiet of things unsaid but a clear demarcation line. We both knew something had fundamentally changed. My first stop that morning was the bank, not the branch where I'd already changed the deed, but a different one across town. I'd done my research carefully over the past week, making phone calls, when Susan and Elizabeth were out of the house. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," the young banker greeted me, looking up my account information. "I see here you'd like to open a new account today." "Yes," I confirmed. "A separate checking account in my name only. After Robert died, I'd added Susan to all my accounts, just in case." Another decision I now regretted. She rarely contributed to household expenses, despite having a good job at the local community college, and I'd noticed money disappearing occasionally, small amounts that she never mentioned. Creating this new account was step one in my plan to disentangle our finances. The banker walked me through the process efficiently, and within 30 minutes I had a new account with a debit card that would arrive in the mail within the week. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" he asked. "Yes," I said, pulling out a small notebook where I'd written down exactly what I needed. "I'd like to transfer funds from my joint account to this new one." I'd calculated carefully, leaving enough in the joint account to cover household expenses for the next month, but moving the bulk of my savings, money from Robert's life insurance, and my own careful saving over the years, into the new protected account. My next stop was a storage facility on the edge of town. I'd called ahead and reserved a small unit, something I could afford on my monthly Social Security income. The facility manager, a kind-faced woman about Susan's age, showed me the 10x10 unit I'd be renting. "Will this be enough space for your needs, Mrs. Wilson?" she asked as she unlocked the roll-up door. I looked at the empty concrete floor, imagining it filled with the pieces of my life that mattered most to me. Robert's records, my mother's quilts, the photo albums, and mementos that Susan had deemed disposable. "Yes," I said. "This will do nicely." I paid for 3 months up front and tucked the key and access code into my purse. Phase 2 of my plan was now in place. My third stop was the most difficult. I sat in my car outside a tidy brick building for nearly 10 minutes gathering my courage. The sign read, Golden Years Senior Living Community. Not a nursing home, as Susan had threatened whenever I disagreed with her. If you can't be reasonable, Mom, maybe we need to look into a home for you. But an independent living community for seniors. Inside, I was greeted warmly by a receptionist who called for the community director. Marjorie Davis was a brisk, efficient woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Mrs. Wilson, welcome to Golden Years. What can I help you with today? I'd like information about your apartments, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. I'm considering a change in my living situation. Marjorie gave me a thoughtful look. Of course. Why don't we start with a tour, and then we can discuss availability and financial considerations. For the next hour, she showed me around the community. The apartments were small but well-designed, each with a kitchenette, bedroom, living area, and accessible bathroom. There were community spaces. A dining room where residents could choose to take meals, a library, a garden area, and a craft room that particularly caught my eye. We have a quilting group that meets on Thursdays, Marjorie mentioned, following my gaze to the sewing machines set up in one corner. Are you a quilter, Mrs. Wilson? I used to be, I admitted. It's been a while. We ended the tour in Marjorie's office, where she laid out the financial details. The monthly cost was significant but not impossible with my Social Security, pension, and the money I'd saved. If I sold the house eventually, I could live here comfortably for many years. We do have a one-bedroom unit becoming available next month, Marjorie said, checking her computer. The current resident is moving to be closer to her daughter in Arizona. Next month, I repeated, thinking of all I needed to do before then. Is that too soon? Marjorie asked perceptively. We do have a waiting list for most units, but I could put your name down for something later in the year if you prefer. I took a deep breath. No, next month might be perfect, actually. Can I place a deposit to hold it? Marjorie smiled. Of course. And Mrs. Wilson, may I ask a personal question? When I nodded, she continued gently, Does your family know you're considering this move? I thought about Susan and Elizabeth, about the folders hidden under my mattress, about 5 years of being slowly erased from my own home. No, I answered honestly, and I'd prefer to keep it that way for now. Marjorie nodded, no judgment in her expression. I understand. Many of our residents have found that making this decision independently was important to them. This is about your life and your choices. My life, my choices. How long had it been since anyone had acknowledged that? Simple truth? I wrote a check for the deposit and completed the preliminary paperwork, arranging to come back the following week to finalize everything. As I drove home, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Anxiety about such a big change at my age, sadness, about leaving the home I'd shared with Robert, but underneath it all, a growing sense of empowerment. When I arrived home, the house was quiet. Susan had left a note on the counter. At Elizabeth's college meeting, then shopping, leftovers in a fridge. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, suddenly eager to be alone with my thoughts. On impulse, I continued up to the attic. Now that I knew what I was looking for, I systematically began opening boxes labeled Mom's Things and Storage, making mental inventories of what I would take to my storage unit first. I was so absorbed in my task that I didn't hear Susan and Elizabeth return, didn't hear them calling for me. Only when Susan's head appeared through the attic access did I realize they were home. There you are, she said, sounding irritated. Didn't you hear us calling? What are you doing up here again? I looked at my daughter, wondering how to answer. The truth seemed simplest. I'm looking through my things that matter to me. Susan's eyes narrowed, taking in the open boxes surrounding me. Are you still upset about those folders? Mom, you're blowing this whole thing out of proportion. I asked quietly. You made an inventory of my belongings while I'm still alive, deciding what to sell and what to keep. You've been planning to sell my home as soon as I'm gone. How exactly am I supposed to proportion that, Susan? Susan's face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She climbed the rest of the way into the attic, dust motes dancing in the air around her as she approached. Mom, we need to be practical about these things, she said, her voice taking on that rehearsed, patient tone that made my skin crawl. Everyone plans for the future. It's the responsible thing to do. Planning for the future is one thing, I replied, carefully placing my mother's wedding photo back in its box. Planning to erase me is another. Oh, for God's sake. Susan threw up her hands. No one is trying to erase you. This is exactly why we didn't discuss these things with you. You get so emotional. I stood slowly, brushing dust from my slacks. Perhaps I'm emotional because these are my memories you're so casually discarding. My life you're planning to pack away as soon as I'm gone. Fine. Susan crossed her arms. What would you like us to do with all this? Stuff when you're gone? Keep everything exactly as it is forever? Turn the house into some kind of shrine? What I would like, I said calmly, is to be treated with respect while I'm still here, to have some say in what happens to the things that matter to me, to not discover that my daughter and granddaughter are counting the days until I'm gone so they can cash in. Susan flinched at that, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she masked it with indignation. That's not fair. We've taken care of you for years. We've put our lives on hold. Taken care of me? I interrupted, a rare occurrence that seemed to startle us both. Susan, I invited you to live in my home when you had nowhere else to go. I gave up my bedroom, my kitchen, my say in my own house. How exactly have you been taking care of me? We keep you company, Susan shot back. Make sure you're not alone. Cook meals that are actually healthy, unlike all that fatty food you used to make. Drive you to appointments. Do you have any idea how much time that takes out of my schedule? The brutal honesty of her response knocked the wind out of me. So that's how she saw it. Not as a daughter caring for her mother out of love, but as a caretaker fulfilling obligations, watching the clock, resenting every minute. I'm sorry to have been such a burden, I said quietly. That's not what Susan began, then stopped abruptly as Elizabeth's voice called up from below. Mom, there's a weird letter for you. Susan frowned, momentarily distracted. What letter? It's from Golden Years Senior Living, Elizabeth called back. Why would they be sending you mail? Susan's puzzled expression shifted suddenly to suspicion as she looked back at me. Mom, what's going on? I took a deep breath. This wasn't how I'd planned to tell them, but perhaps it was better this way. No chance to rehearse excuses or plan manipulations. We should go downstairs, I said simply, moving toward the attic stairs. In the kitchen, Elizabeth was examining the envelope, curiosity written across her young face. She looked up as we entered, her eyes moving between her mother and me. What's this about? She asked, handing the envelope to Susan. Susan tore it open, quickly scanning the contents. Her face paled, then flushed with anger as she looked up at me. An apartment confirmation? A receipt for a deposit? She waved the paper in the air. You're moving into a senior living facility without even discussing it with us? Yes, I said, feeling oddly calm in the face of her building rage. I'm moving next month. Elizabeth's jaw dropped. Seriously, Grandma? You're just leaving? I'm not just leaving, I corrected her. I'm choosing to live independently, in a place where I'll have my own space and be treated with respect. This is ridiculous, Susan spluttered. You can't live on your own. You need us. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me. Just moments ago, she'd been complaining about the burden of taking care of me. Now, suddenly, I couldn't possibly manage without them. I've lived on my own before, I reminded her. For 2 years after your father died, before you moved in, I managed perfectly. Well then, that was different, Susan insisted. You were younger. And what about money? These places are expensive. I have my Social Security, my pension, and my savings, I said. I've worked it out with the financial counselor at Golden Years. I can afford it. Susan's eyes narrowed. What? Savings? Our joint account doesn't have nearly enough. She stopped suddenly, realization dawning. You've moved money, haven't you? That's where you went the other day. I nodded, not bothering to deny it. I opened a new account, in my name only. You had no right, Susan exploded. That money was for all of us, for our future. It's my money, Susan, I said firmly, from your father's life insurance and my own savings. And apparently, according to your plans, your future didn't include me anyway. Elizabeth, who had been watching this exchange with wide eyes, finally spoke up. But Grandma, what about the house? You can't just, this is our home now too. The house is still mine, I said gently, feeling a pang of sympathy for my granddaughter despite everything. She was young, following her mother's lead. You and your mother can continue living here for now, if you wish. We'll need to discuss rent arrangements. Rent? Susan practically shouted. You expect us to pay rent to live in our own home? It's not your home, Susan, I corrected her. As you recently discovered, the deed is in my name only. If you choose to stay, You'll need to contribute to the mortgage and utilities, just as any adult would. Susan stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. I can't believe what I'm hearing. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? By abandoning us and then charging us rent? I'm not abandoning anyone, I said. I'm choosing to live my remaining years with dignity, surrounded by people who respect me. And yes, if you're both working adults living in a house you don't own, paying rent is the normal expectation. This is all because of those stupid folders. Isn't it? Susan's voice rose in frustration. You're punishing us because you snooped through my private things and didn't like what you found. No, Susan, I shook my head. This is because for 5 years I've gradually been erased from my own home. The folders were just the final confirmation that I needed to make a change. Elizabeth, looking somewhat shell-shocked, turned to her mother. Mom, maybe we should… Don't you dare take her side, Susan snapped. This is emotional manipulation, pure and simple. She's trying to make us feel guilty so we'll beg her to stay. I almost laughed at the absurdity. I don't want you to beg me to stay, Susan. I've made my decision. I'm moving next month. And what about us? Susan demanded. Where are we supposed to go? As I said, you can stay here if you'd like and pay rent. Or you can find another place. That's entirely up to you. I turned to put the kettle on for tea, a small act of normalcy in the midst of this chaos. You're being incredibly selfish, Susan said, her voice trembling with anger. Thinking only about yourself. I turned back to face my daughter, studying her for a long moment, the little girl who used to climb into my lap for comfort after a nightmare. The teenager who'd rolled her eyes at my outdated advice. The woman who'd shown up on my doorstep, needing shelter. The stranger who'd planned to sell my home and discard my memories. Perhaps I am being selfish, I acknowledged. But after decades of putting everyone else first, your father, you, Elizabeth, I think I've earned the right to prioritize my own happiness for whatever time I have left. So that's it? Susan's voice cracked slightly. You're just done with us? I'm not done with anyone, I said softly. I'm just beginning to live on my terms again. Whether you're part of that life going forward is up to you. Susan stared at me for a long moment, then grabbed her purse from the counter. I need some air. This is insane. She stormed out the mine-eye, back door, letting it slam behind her. Elizabeth remained, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. Grandma, she began hesitantly. I didn't mean what you heard at breakfast that day, about peace when you die. I was just repeating something, Mom said. I looked at my granddaughter, still so young, so influenced by her mother's attitudes. That doesn't make it any less hurtful, Elizabeth. She lowered her eyes. I know. I'm sorry. It was the first genuine apology I'd heard in this house for years. Not enough to change my plans, but enough to give me hope that perhaps, with time and distance, something might be salvaged between us. Thank you for saying that, I said quietly. 1 month later, I stood in the center of my new apartment at Golden Years, surrounded by carefully selected treasures from my life. Robert's records were arranged alphabetically on a shelf beside a small turntable, my first purchase for this new chapter. My mother's quilts added warmth to the bed and the armchair by the window. Family photographs, the ones that mattered most to me, adorned the walls, including pictures of Susan and Elizabeth. Despite everything, they were still my family. The morning sun streamed through curtains I had chosen myself, casting a golden glow across the small but comfortable space. My space. My choices. The last 4 weeks had been a whirlwind of activity. After our confrontation, Susan had alternated between cold silence and tearful accusations of abandonment. Elizabeth had been quieter, watching our interactions with troubled eyes, occasionally helping me sort through belongings when Susan wasn't around. Why are you taking these old records? She'd asked one afternoon, examining the worn sleeve of a Nat King Cole album. You don't even have a record player anymore. These were your grandfather's favorites, I explained, running my fingers over the familiar cover. This one was playing the night he proposed to me. Elizabeth had studied the album with newfound interest. I never knew that. She'd looked at me curiously. There's a lot I don't know about you, isn't there, Grandma? It was a small moment of connection, one of several that had given me hope that my relationship with my granddaughter might be salvaged, even if things with Susan remained strained. Susan had refused to help with my move, a final attempt at control through withdrawal. If you're determined to abandon us, you can do it on your own, she'd declared dramatically. But I wasn't on my own. Elizabeth had surprised me by showing up on moving day, along with Marjorie from Golden Years and two kind maintenance men who carried my heavier furniture. Between the four of us, we'd managed just fine. Now, a week after settling in, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. My daily routine was my own again. Morning coffee on my small balcony overlooking the community garden, an afternoon quilting class where I'd already met 3 women who might become friends, dinner either in my kitchenette or in the community dining room depending on my mood. No one moved my things without asking. No one changed the channel while I was watching television. No one sighed impatiently while I took my time completing a task. The silence in my apartment wasn't the suffocating quiet of being ignored, but the peaceful stillness of being at home, in my own space. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. I wasn't expecting visitors. Opening the door, I found Elizabeth standing in the hallway, a small potted plant in her hands. "Grandma," she said, looking nervous. "I hope it's okay that I came by. I wanted to see your new place." "Of course." I stepped aside, genuinely pleased to see her. "Come in." Elizabeth entered, glancing around with undisguised curiosity. "It's nice," she said, sounding surprised. "Cozier than I expected." "It suits me," I replied, taking the plant she offered, a small African violet in bloom. "Thank you for this. It's lovely." Elizabeth wandered around the apartment, examining the photographs, running her fingers over my mother's quilt on the armchair, noticing the record player. "You got a new turntable," she observed. "Yes," I smiled. "I play one of your grandfather's records every evening. It makes me feel close to him." Elizabeth nodded, then took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Mom doesn't know I'm here. She's still pretty mad." "I figured as much," I said, gesturing for her to sit. "How are things at the house?" "Weird," Elizabeth admitted, perching on the edge of the armchair. "Mom's been talking to real estate agents about apartments. I think she finally believes you're serious about the rent thing." I nodded. I'd had my attorney send a formal letter outlining the rental terms, fair market value, with the first month free to give them time to adjust. "And how are you doing with all of this?" I asked gently. Elizabeth shrugged, looking down at her hands. "I miss you," she said quietly. "And I feel bad about, the things we said, the things we did." Her honesty touched me. "I miss you too," I admitted. "Could I maybe visit sometimes?" she asked hesitantly. "Like, regularly? I could come for dinner or something?" I felt a rush of warmth toward my granddaughter. "I'd like that very much."